in my mind, when we talk about what's happening in Ukraine, it seems like it's done. Ukraine, there's nothing that Ukraine can do to turn this around. The only possibility is if it goes nuclear, if all of NATO comes in, but that just doesn't seem like a
Yeah,
possibility
I
to
don't
me. It
think so.
seems
Yeah.
right. It seems so. It's just it's a tragedy what's happening, and it's just kind of a story of how much damage can be afflicted on Europe during this whole process, and of course Ukraine is just going to be utterly destroyed, and how much territory that Russia's going to take. But there, it doesn't seem to me like there's any way the story is kind of written now. I feel like to a large
Yeah,
extent. Would
well,
you agree?
I think it's written to the extent that Russia will win this war. And, it's a question of how. And I think, I agree with John Mearsheimer that it will be an ugly victory. He's confident that they will. And it was never even in doubt, really, for anybody who was looking at the bigger picture, even back in early, or let's say the fall of 2022, when Ukraine had its success in the Kharkov region and the Kherson region. Anyone looking at just the balance of forces, of productive power, of population, of total armaments. There's just no question that the Russians, when they set their mind to, and they did immediately. It was in the fall of 22 that Putin mobilized 300,000 reservists, and then they began the process of a voluntary enlistment that is built up the forces. And so anyway, they were always going to win. They are winning, and it's a question of what kind of victory it will be. How far will they go? What and then I think the other big question is also is like we've discussed earlier is how the West will take it. What will the repercussions be in the West? I think in there are going to be repercussions, for all of the NATO countries, including the U.S. But the greatest impact will be on Europe, and it could lead to the rise of these alternative parties, of these populist parties that always oppose these policies. That maybe it's just like the people will vote for them overwhelmingly, and they'll be able to overcome the kind of the blockades that have been put on them by the establishment. That's a possibility, at least in some countries. But it could also, because at the same time, you see this trend towards growing authoritarianism in places like Romania and Germany, just uh, throughout Europe. And maybe we'll have that authoritarianism will only intensify. And, it'll now they do everything in the name of democracy at some point, which is absurd. Canceling elections in the name of democracy, suppressing political parties in the name of democracy. Um, at some point, they may even drop the pretense, and they just will, say we're
No more democracy.
yeah, right. The democracy was a mistake. We wise people will now rule you. Shut up. We'll see.
It,
It's going to be interesting.
if these alternative powers do parties do come to power, would we look at potentially countries leaving NATO or the EU? Would this spell the end of the American empire if European
Yeah.
countries start to break away and say, we're done being vassals of the U.S. The U.S. has destroyed our energy infrastructure here. They pushed us to this, then pushed these
Yeah.
sanctions on Russia that we have been bearing the brunt of. Really, Europeans have, not the Americans, and not even
Yeah.
really the Russians so much. Right? It's
Right.
Europe that is suffering thanks to all the policies that are pretty much written in Washington D.C. and then handed to the people in London and Brussels, and they just go along with it. So
Yeah.
you think there has to
Right.
build up enough resentment where they just
Yeah.
like, we're
Yeah.
done with the
Right.
NATO, we're done with
I'd
the
say one
EU.
thing. Yeah, clear. It is true that these countries are vassals of the U.S., but it seems to me that they're very willing vassals. That a lot of these European countries are even more gung ho on these policies than the Americans are. Uh, I should say, the governments. Again, with a few exceptions, like maybe in the Baltics, it's really not the people. Um, but yeah, as for what you're saying about NATO possibly breaking up, it could. I would say again, it's sort of like there are. I see like history is always more creative than our own imaginations. When you look into the future, you see some possibilities, and then there's always something that happens that you just never even saw. But what I see the main, let's say, just to simplify things, the two roads, the one towards authoritarianism, the one towards the right, of the populist parties, which are mostly considered conservative, but some of them are leftist, right? Um, Okay, that's one possibility. The other is the rising authoritarianism. So, NATO, what happens to NATO kind of depends on that. If it's the populist parties that win the battle, yeah, it may spell the end of NATO. It may mean that NATO starts to break up as some of these countries pull out and say we don't want to be a part of this. But then if we have the authoritarian model, actually NATO might even become a greater force. It just is something that's imposed to you may have some sort of fortress Europe where they circle the wagons and they actually start to devote a lot of money to defense spending. So far, it's all been talk. There's been very, very little increase. So I kind of wonder if they really have the will to go down that. I mean, we'll go down that road, but we'll see.
Right. And kind of what I've learned during this conflict is that the numerical value you put towards your military doesn't really mean that much. When we say that these countries are going to devote more of their GDP to defense spending, really as part of NATO, it almost seems like we will give more money to the U.S. defense industries to purchase weapons. There's not really so much the ability. I mean, look, Germany can't even manufacture commercial vehicles anymore thanks to the energy cutoff. How do they expect to ramp up and all of a sudden start churning out planes and tanks? It's not going to happen. You can just throw money at it and just throw it down the drain. I don't see them really
that's
building
a good point.
up.
Yeah, actually, that's one thing that we've just learned about the U.S. military. The U.S. spends an extraordinary amount of money on its military. It's close to half of what all the money that's spent in the world on militaries. So if the value, the dollar value really was reflective of the of military capacity, of effectiveness, then the U.S. shouldn't have any peers. Again, the U.S. spends, I don't know exactly what the ratio is, but it's 5-1 or 10-1 compared to Russia.
Yeah, probably greater, to be honest.
Depending on how you measure it. But it's a very, very lopsided. There's no equity between the two. The U.S. spends much, much more than Russia does. So, by those rights, and of course, they're just one of the countries in NATO. Again, if you were looking at the amount of money that's spent on the military, and a lot of people looked at this, myself included, when the SMO began in 2022, there should have been no contest. NATO should have won hands down. But I think we're learning is that the value that the monetary value does not reflect the reality, and I think too, we see countries promising to increase their defense spending, countries in Europe to increase their defense spending to, let's say, 3%. It doesn't mean anything, if in the end, because you could raise the prices by that much and then you've done it, right? And that's probably what's going to happen is that, because of inflation and the growing demand for this limited resource, prices will rise. And so it'll be easy for them to reach that 3% threshold, but there will be no change in the underlying reality.
Right. I think that's just proof of corruption, right? And essentially money laundering through, if you're being able to spend this amount of money and you're not really getting anything out, that just means you're just lining pockets of, the military industrial complex, people that are associated to it.
Yeah,
that's
right. It's again, it's not necessarily that any laws were broken. It's kind of open and above board corruption. It's institutional corruption. It's an institutional arrangement that doesn't provide, the goods that are actually needed, but enriches the people that are involved. Yeah.
Right. Do you think that's becoming exposed to most of the elite, that they're aware that this is the situation, that, hey, we spend all this money, but they know that it's not producing anything. I mean, if they
I
have to go to
haven't.
Africa or South Korea, I say, give us some artillery shells. Anybody got Patriot missiles? Whatever you can
Yeah.
give us. Then surely people will realize that, hey, this is,
Right.
and this is
I
kind of
don't.
what.
I don't think it's penetrated into the establishments. I think that they're still, it's. We've talked about this a lot. It's just part of this general supremacist mindset. It's just something that they can't abandon, and so it's hard for them to say, "Hey, yeah, we're in trouble. We need to really retool, reconfigure, reindustrialize." They haven't raised the alarm bells. Just you find at the edges, some analysts make comments and occasionally it leaks into one of the major newspapers, but in general, that's not what's happening. It's just it seems like they still inhabit that old mindset, and they're just not going to let go of it.
When Ukraine loses this war, what do you think will be the biggest consequence for the outcome of this for the United States? Will it just be proof that the U.S. is a paper tiger, NATO is a paper tiger, or is it going to be, kind of what we said, the potential, either the new
Yeah,
authoritarian order of Europe, or the throwing off the shackles of the U.S.
yeah,
empire
right.
and the
Yeah,
end of the United States? I mean, what do you think is?
yeah. I think I'll just say again that the impact will be much greater on Europe. Already it is. It's easier for the U.S. to walk away from wars because, again, we're out there. We have a continent pretty much unto ourselves, oceans on each side, and we can just, we won't be able to shake it off completely like so many of our other wars. It won't be possible to memory hold it in the same way. So it will damage the reputation of the U.S. internationally, and I think domestically too. Probably not as much as it should. We have a remarkable spin machine. It'll all be the fault of the Ukrainians, the fault of the Europeans, and already we're seeing this. There are stories being appearing in papers about how we're disappointed in the way that the Ukrainians are using this weapon system or that weapon system. We suggested this and they didn't do that. They're not mobilizing 18-year-olds soon enough. It's all their fault. And I think we'll get a lot of that. And it'll work to some extent, but I don't think it'll be entirely successful. This will be two major defeats. So it will damage the reputation of the U.S. And now how that plays out in the U.S. is hard to say. Again, it's just sort of, you're dealing with an irrational elite. Does it mean that they actually become more aggressive? Does it mean that they actually kind of sober up and start focusing on their, addressing the weaknesses that were exposed? Remains to be seen. And again, I'll just say for Europe, there's the authoritarian tendency, and then there's the populist. And we could see both things happening. It could be part of Europe retreats into fortress Europe, and then other countries break away. Interestingly, like one of those countries that might break away is Italy. There was a poll came out just a few days ago that showed has support for the present policy in Ukraine. It's just like as long as it takes kind of policy, right? And that support for that was highest among the polled countries. It was highest in Sweden, followed by Denmark, and then the UK. And all in those three countries, there was majority support for that policy. But then in these other countries, the majority actually supported reducing aid to Ukraine and pushing them to negotiate and to give up territories. And you found that in Germany, in France, in Spain, but above all in Italy. Like in Italy, it was very striking. The results were something like 4-1 in favor of ending the conflict and ceasing support to Ukraine. 4-1. It was very, very striking.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there is this vassal mindset within Europe, but it's much more concentrated within smaller countries with populations 10 million less, because we talk about the Baltic states and we talk about the Scandinavian countries. These are countries with low populations, and they're the most, I think, terrified of the idea of not being under the US's wing. And I've noticed this mentality even talking with my European friends. You know, I have a good friend in Norway, and I remember him saying like, well, you know, we would much rather be ruled by America than China. You know, it's like this is why, and I was just like, this is a dumb mindset. Like, you're Norwegian. You know, why there isn't. Don't be ruled by either. You know, but there
Yeah.
is. I think that mentality, and I think it's been very ingrained since World War II. They've just kind of felt like we are under the U.S. umbrella, and they will keep us safe, and we need to do whatever we want. We can't disappoint our U.S. masters. And I think that when you're a small country of a population of 5 million, something like this, you that feeling might be exacerbated a little bit, because whereas these larger countries like Italy, Spain, and France, they have some sense of autonomy. They have a history. There's a little bit there, but
Yeah, I'm
do
sure
you think
there's
there's
quite a
some
bit of
truth to
truth
that?
to that. I think there is, but I'll also point out that two of those Northern European countries were neutral, Sweden and Finland, all through the Cold War, and it served them very, very well. You know, Sweden goes back even farther. Um, it served them very well. They were very prosperous countries, you know, and they recently abandoned this, and now, you know, we have Sweden, and I'm sure it's true of Finland. I don't think it was included in this survey, but I think you would find very similar results in Finland. For some reason, it's just they've become very Russophobic. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it really is. Maybe we can talk just a little bit about this Russia's shadow fleet, because I've been seeing headlines into it. First, I just want to know. I'll read you the headlines first. So the New
Okay.
York Times had a headline that said, "Has Russia's shadow fleet built to evade sanctions added sabotage to its lists?"
Uh-huh.
Business Insider: Germany calls for new sanctions on Russia's dark fleet that is damaging major undersea cables nearly every month. Political
Right.
says Finland probes Russian shadow fleet involvement in new Baltic cable break. So the way that these titles, if you read the headlines, it just sounds like there's this clandestine Russian fleet that's going out there breaking cables and committing sabotage across the high seas, essentially
Yeah.
pirates. Is that
Right.
what's going on?
Clearly, yeah, yeah. Actually, the whole, shadow fleet, I think was a stroke of genius on the part of the propagandists in the West. It's called the shadow fleets. It quite literally sounds shady, right? Something that's rather nefarious, underhanded. And my understanding is simply that they don't get their insurance through Lloyd's of London, basically, which insures most ships in the world. And um, they don't, because Lloyd's of London complies with the sanctions on the ships. There's the price cap, and then other various sanctions efforts to limit the export of Russian oil. So the Russians went to other insurers,
So
and
there's nothing illegal, or
absolutely nothing illegal. Absolutely nothing illegal. So the whole shadow thing is just it implies, it doesn't go out, and they don't actually go out and say this is illegal, but by using these terms, they suggest that in people's minds. This is something really kind of obviously kind of, again, semi-criminal, but it's nothing of the sort. It's just a very open and legal way of evading sanctions by going to other insurers, insurers in India or other parts of the world. Um, and then I think, like we talked about the recent incident in the Baltic, or the cable between, I believe it was
Estonia and
Finland
Finland?
in Estonia, right, was cut. It was a communication, I know, electric power cable.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that, they've accused the Russians. They said there was a Russian tanker there, and they actually seized the tanker. And now these stories are coming out. So at the time I speculated that it could be, just speculated that it could be a false flag. Now I find myself leaning even more towards it because of the way it's being used in the news. I don't know, who knows what happened, but it just seems to me highly unlikely for the Russians to do this. It's not to their benefit at all, but it is to the benefit of people of the establishment, with the Western, hegemonists, who are trying to shut down the export trade, and they're going right now. They are going after the so-called shadow fleet in a big way. I think just recently, the Biden administration came up with new sanctions against the Russian fleet. Now they're going after ship owners. A lot of these ships are not owned by the Russians. They're just um, other countries or companies in different countries around the world are have provided these for transport of Russian oil. Now they're going after those ship owners, um, and this story about what happened in the Baltic Sea, helps to apply the pressure and to scare people away from these ships, maybe insurers or whoever might be involved. And then it's actually it could hurt the Russians in the short run, but it's the history of these sanctions is that they always find a way around them. And it may be that the Russians themselves will just have to buy all these ships. And, there will be people that are very willing to sell them to them. And then the sanctions, they're sanction proof. Obviously the courts in Russia are not going to impose fines on Russian ship owners. But it is a part of this economic war, part of this energy war. And again, one that's actually, again, just like everything else we pointed to in this economic war, is self-destructive. Because by making it more difficult for the Russians to export oil, you're reducing the amount of oil on the world markets, and therefore you're going to raise the prices of oil around the world, including in the U.S. in this case. So everybody's going to suffer because of this. And I think that's actually a reason that the Biden administration didn't do this until after the election, because they understood this
high gas prices for Trump.
Right. So if they did it back in the spring or in the summer, it could have led to, it would have led to an increase in gas prices, and it would have damaged Harris's election effort.
Man, is it so much hard to ask for just to have a leader that wants to do something good for your country, that has the best interest of your country at heart? Let's lower the cost of living for people, peace and prosperity. It's not a big ask, right?
Yeah.
I just don't understand how it seems like all of our politicians, it's about let's make life more miserable for our people because it might hurt this other politician, or I don't even care about these people. I just
think
hate Russia so much that I just want to do this.
I think it's the latter. It's not that they're actually trying to immiserate their own population.
Well, I mean,
they don't
clearly,
care.
Well, Biden obviously, to some extent here, he knows that he said he didn't do this before because he didn't want to have higher energy prices in the U.S. during this time. But now that he's out, he's like, well, screw the American people. Let's raise gas prices.
Obviously, he doesn't care, right? It's just again, his hatred for Russia overrides everything. That's what it. And also he says, maybe it'll hurt Trump. People will be angry because energy prices go up, and they'll blame that on him. Now, if Trump were smart, I think it's as soon as he came into power, he would simply, lift those sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
But he may be, you just never know with Trump. Again, you have a lot of people with it, among those that he appointed, that are completely on board with these kind of policies. And they just may convince him not to. But he should, just hopefully he will lift or reimpose, rather, the restrictions on the ATACMS missiles.
Yeah, I just wonder, how did Western politics, how did they all become captured by the globalists? How come nobody's really thinking about the best interests of their countries? It's all this ridiculous game.
And there's just this hive mind that you find. There used to be a greater diversity of thought. France was always kind of independent within Europe. It wasn't part of NATO for the longest time. And then, I think part of the problem is actually the creation of the EU. Originally, it was supposed to be just a mechanism for economic cooperation, but it's become much more than that. And over time, a central government has developed in Brussels that has been taking power over, and there's been a general transfer of power from the countries, the individual countries, the member states, to this central unelected bureaucracy in Brussels. And the U.S. has always been in favor of that because they just much rather, it used to be it was messy. You had to deal with each, convince each separate European state, to come on board. And sometimes the country would, like France, remember during the the Iraq
Terror,
War.
right?
Yeah. And so that's why you had freedom fries and all that.
They tasted better.
Yeah. Right. But anyway, so the U.S. was always in favor of the centralization, and now they've really got, their wish came true. So it does make it easier to impose uniformity, and that's one reason anyway that we're seeing this uniformity, this hive mind throughout the West, is that you do have, Brussels subordinate to Washington, it just, we do have almost, not exactly a unitary state, but something that's approaching that.
Right. I just feel like it can't last forever, but something that I've always...
these self-destructive policies, right? In the end, they're their own worst enemies. In the end, it's really, it's not going to be Russia. Well, we never can be sure exactly how it's going to play out, but I think it's most likely it's just going to be our own self-destructive policies that bring us down more than anything else.